Welcome and good evening to our guests, students, faculty, alumni, colleagues, and friends. My name is Marcella Del Signore. I'm an associate professor and director of the MS in Architecture, Urban and Regional Design at the School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. And I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this event on behalf of our Dean, Maria Perbellini. New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design is participating through multiple events to the 17th International Architecture Exhibition, Venice Biennale 2021. Some of the work of our students is in fact exhibited at the Italian pavilion titled Resilient Communities, curated by Alessandro Mellis in the section Architecture as Caregiver, curated by our Dean Perbellini. Today's event is also part of the virtual Italian pavilion, City X Venice, curated by Tom Kovac and Alessandro Mellis, with creative director Maria Perbellini. The theme of our lecture series is correlational crisis. 2020 marked a critical year in which environmental, health, economic, and social crises had become correlated, bringing forth the emergence of unforeseen global issues to be addressed with urgency. The Summer and Fall 2021 Lectures and Events series at the School of Architecture and Design at New York Institute of Technology creates opportunities to discuss how architecture, design, and urbanism can disclose implicit parameters and activate structural transformations in our ecological, social, and built environments. From how reality is measured and validated to automation and computational thinking, the series aims to question possibilities for disciplinary action. So welcome again, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Marcella, for introducing us. I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's lecture. This is part of an ongoing series related to the role of the relationship of minorities to architecture and the built environment. And tonight's lecture is no less of a conversation than what we've done in the past. We are very interested in appreciating and investigating the way in which different communities actually respond to the same urban environment. We probably all have a certain pre-notion about how urban environments are built and what they're built for, but it's obviously comes to nobody's surprise today that the way in which we relate to this urban environment is very diverse, depending on our backgrounds and our histories. So we'd like to continue that today's discussion by introducing two very special guests, Jonah Rowan, who I met through work at the New School. I was very introduced to him when he was proposing and when he had a special lecture series on the role of slaves in the fabrication of America's infrastructure and how the ramifications that had through different communities and different sites. Jonah could talk about that for all day, but then I discovered, of course, that Jonah is much more widely knowledge about the relation of different communities to different resources that they have, whether it's environmental space, economic resources, environmental resources. And he's going to talk about some of that today and help us learn a bit about that. Craig, our other guest, of course, is well known with his past history of discussing the urban space, especially in relation to the African-American communities around America. And again, Craig could take one subject and talk about it all day, but I was introduced to Craig when he was discussing hip hop architecture, which maybe today is a bit of an old term, but the issues that raise are still relevant. And I'd like to have him discuss some of the more contemporary or the newer ideas that are still reflecting the same old issues, I'd argue. And I'd also like to thank the Lectures and Events Committee, Pablo, and everyone involved in that, and Maria, of course, for letting us, for enabling this lecture series, and everybody who's been involved, Susan and Young Tae, and everybody involved in the process. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jonah and have you introduce yourself further and start your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Boyega, and thanks to Pablo and Marcella and Hunte for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to be able to share some of my work. And so I'll just share my screen. So this evening, I'm going to be presenting sort of speculative historical research that I've done in the context of Kingston, Jamaica, on the construction of the physical city and its water infrastructure as a manifestation, basically, of who counted among the category of the public from the era of enslavement through emancipation and continued British colonial occupation of Jamaica. 19th century Kingston, Jamaica, was a site of racial tensions from the era of enslavement in Britain up to 1834, when enslaved people were formally emancipated. But de facto chattel slavery continued for another several years under the so-called apprenticeship system, under which Black people were forced to work under the conditions of slavery while being paid nominal wages based on the presumption that they would have to be trained to live as free people. Very soon after full emancipation in 1838, newly free Black Jamaicans began to organize to gain political power, to elect representatives to the colonial governmental bodies, the House of Assembly and legislature, but the ruling white elite preempted those efforts by basically changing the rules. Thus, we see the dynamics of whites living in fear of Blacks, but here Black and mixed race people constituted a significant majority of the Jamaican population. And so who got to be counted as citizens versus who were mere subjects of the British government? In other words, who made up the Jamaican public, therefore became a matter of vital importance. This story has spatial and infrastructural analogs, which conditioned both the political history of Jamaica and Kingston in particular, and the material constitution of the city itself. So specifically the provision of water to the city, who had access to that water, from which sources and in what locations. This indexes how the city was constructed politically and physically as the Jamaican population transitioned away from slavery. Overviews of the city, like what you see here from the early to mid 18th century, show a bustling urban environment, all propelled by the stolen labor of Black people up to this point. With the liberalization of labor policy toward wage compensation in place of forced labor, the volume of production diminished as British landowners anticipated a downturn and divested from their Jamaican business ventures, and formerly enslaved people were left to their own devices without any safety net. When we look at a map of the distribution of enslaved people, of the enslaved population in urban Jamaica immediately prior to emancipation, we see concentrations around the perimeter of the island, but by far the largest portion of enslaved people were in Kingston. And that population was even greater with the metropolitan area of Port Royal and Spanish Town, the colony's governmental center, all urban agglomerations within just a few miles of each other. So on the periphery of Kingston, Spanish Town, and Port Royal, accounts described settlements of what are described as, quote, Negro huts. And a 1744 act dictated that 4 or more such dwellings clustered together must be enclosed by a fence 7 feet high with only 1 gate to restrict enslaved people's mobility. In other words, to control this element of the population. In Kingston itself, the enslaved population was densest near the harbor, as you see here, with scattered so-called yards or areas, as I just described, devised for control of groups of enslaved people. A plan of the city from the mid-18th century that you see here shows this regimented grid planned and executed by the British Royal Engineers, but implemented by enslaved builders. The map notes two main boulevards, King and Queen Street, each enumerated 66 feet wide, a few other wide streets at 40 feet, and most others at 30 feet, as well as relatively strictly delineated lots and dimensions. All of this gesture in the direction of a highly ordered, geometricized society reflected in the image of the city. The one unfilled area in this rectilinear grid is the parade ground, notably a space for the projection of disciplinary authority. This French map from 1764 marks the centerpiece of the parade, which still exists, with a square labeled Grand Citerne, or which is what you see on the bottom right, Grand Citerne or water tank in the Place d'Armes, the parade ground. So to make sense of how this city was built in terms of layout and infrastructure, and how that physical layout set the terms for the construction of a public through the construction of the city, we have to turn back to the earliest days of British inhabitation of the island. Around 1655, when the English annexed Jamaica from Spain as part of the so-called Western Design, by which England would weaken Spain, an English officer, Richard Hope, settled in Jamaica to try agriculture there. But when soldiers under him proved to be unsatisfactory farmers, enslavement provided a path toward economic productivity. The Hope Plantation, which is what you see here, developed over the following century into an enormously lucrative sugar labor camp, with the Hope River supplying motive power for grinding machinery for sugar production. In the mid-18th century, the proprietor of Hope, a grandson of the original colonial settler and lieutenant governor of Kingston, granted water rights to the city of Kingston under a handshake agreement that conformed to a model referred to elsewhere as, quote, gentlemanly capitalism, which is to say a bestowal of a commodity that redounded to the benefit of the giver by enhancing his social status and without a formal contract in place. A later deal segmented the flow of the Hope River, which is what you see on the right here, proportionally among three neighboring plantations, conveyed by an aqueduct that still cuts across the campus of the University of the West Indies. This is the aqueduct, but the offer to supply water to Kingston was soon rescinded in favor of the Hope Plantation using the tailwater from this aqueduct for driving the mills to irrigate cane fields. In other words, what had been offered as a public service in essence became privatized. By the late 18th century, legal cases were being prosecuted, but the city's water supply was fetid and inadequate, so that even the army had trouble securing fresh water for its base, and the Navy found difficulty in watering docked ships. And this is especially important because Kingston was an important Royal Navy harbor supply site. Meanwhile, the family that owned the Hope Plantation had married into the peerage based on wealth acquired from sugar cultivation on the backs of enslaved Black workers, and used that wealth to buy a private pied-à-terre row house in London designed by the fashionable architects, the brothers Robert and James Adams. So that's what you see here, Chandos House. As the situation in Kingston and Spanish Town became more intolerable, the chronicler James Hakewill, whose illustration you see here, wrote in the 1820s that Kingston planned the parade with a central fountain, which is the Grand Citerne in this Belin map, to receive water from the Hope River, but lost out on municipal beautification funding, this is in the 1820s, to the administrative center of Spanish Town, when white elites voted to locate this still extant statue of Admiral George Rodney, an enslaver himself, there in Spanish Town. In 1841, finally, Queen Victoria passed an act for supplying the city of Kingston and Ligüenea with good and wholesome water from the Hope River and for other purposes, again, run by a former enslaver. The company, run by rich white entrepreneurs and propelled with investment capital from wealthy white property owning former slaveholders, several of whom had been financially compensated for the loss of their enslaved property upon emancipation. Each of these white former enslavers received a royal contract that mandated it supply, the company received a royal contract that mandated it supply water for purposes of health and safety, namely, quote, so that the inhabitants of Kingston would, in cases of accidents by fire, be exposed to the most calamitous losses and inconveniences unless more effectual provision is made for furnishing them with an additional supply of water, end quote. Nevertheless, so this is to say what defined citizenship was the supply of water. Nevertheless, who had access remained an issue, as subscribers had to pay relatively steep fees to be supplied with water from the new system. After a number of failed engineering projects, a scheme to bring water from the Hope River finally yielded results in 1849, but the gentlemanly agreement of the mid-18th century gave way to a more properly capitalistic one, in which the Kingston and Leguinea Water Works Company paid landholders for their water rights. An 1843 fire in Kingston that began at a foundry that made iron beds for the military, for the British military, among other products, demonstrated the dire need for water provision to the city, in addition to exposing the lasting inequalities of Jamaican society after emancipation, which is to say, the city's mostly wooden building stock caught fire rather quickly, and some 400 houses, or an entire tenth of the city, was burned, was destroyed. These drawings and images of the paintings of the fire, watercolor paintings of the fire by Isaac Mendes Belisario, show this cacophonous urban landscape and people of all races salvaging what they could while the fire consumed large portions of the built area. A map drawn by the artists Belisario and Adolphe Duperly shows just how much of the city was destroyed, along with cryptic imagery that alludes to fate and chance and uncertainty, aspects of society that the institutions of enslavement were constructed precisely to preempt. And that's true of the sort of grid of the city as well. In other words, to subject complete order and control. Ironically, the one element that might have offered some element of control, the water supply, was insufficient, leading to firefighters running out of water or working with low water pressures. In efforts to staunch the fire's spread, the military was deployed to demolish buildings using artillery, an instance that displays the futility of the situation, literally fighting fire with fire. In other words, demolishing buildings to make sure that the fire wouldn't spread. Meanwhile, in the aftermath, newspaper accounts were quick to blame Black Kingstonians for not contributing more to the firefighting effort, or worse, deploying racial stereotypes of indolent, neglectful, or malicious conduct. Subsequent fires in 1862 and 1883 repeated these same patterns and drew out similar racial animosities. It was the 1862 fire, though, that was part of a much larger movement that would lead to a wholesale restructuring of British colonial policy in Jamaica, and Kingston would be rebuilt. Through the 19th century, the city remained under control of the elite whites, who generally enacted a form of de facto spatial segregation by moving northeast of the parade toward the Leguinea Plain, where they built larger detached houses with walled enclosures. And incidentally, this is still what the kind of pattern of urbanism in Kingston to this day, where there is a kind of segregation based, class segregation. So the wealthy people live sort of to the northwest and on higher ground along what they call Halfway Tree Road. In any event, this paralleled political maneuvers that alienated the island's Black population, and relative differences in political power among racial lines were exacerbated by environmental factors, primarily cycles of droughts and heavy rains through the 1860s that made basic foodstuffs, basics like foodstuffs unaffordable. And so beginning in Morant Bay on the island's southeast coast, protesters across Jamaica rose up in 1865, leading to repressive actions on the part of the white colonial government, in which almost 500 Black people were killed, several executed, another 600 were arrested, 1,000 homes were burned down by colonial forces, and the Black population at large was terrorized in the government's violent suppression and of this unrest. So this so-called Morant Bay Rebellion caused reevaluation across the British Empire of imperial policy, and across meaning to the East Indies as well. This Morant Bay Rebellion, as I said, caused reevaluation of British Empire of imperial policy, with prominent members of British society voicing support or criticism. And so the urban ramifications of those reassessments came with the relocation of the governmental center from Spanish Town to Kingston in 1872, and a further consolidation of power and wealth, again, in the northeast of the city, leaving the area near the harbor in a dejected state, which was worsened as the colonial economy moved toward a reliance on banana production and tourism by the end of the 19th century, with very little investment in the city itself. So once again, we see the dynamics of the area of the city that had been largely populated by Black people, again, being sapped of resources even further as the urban economy turned away from the harbor. Kingston's water infrastructure received an influx of capital investment with the government's relocation to the city, when the new administration made water into a municipal service with new equipment and technology that allowed for higher pressure. And so in 1881, Almanac compared the water quality favorably to that of the Thames in London. But all of this was part of a paternalistic British imperial response to demonstrations by Black people whose purpose was to free themselves finally from the yoke of enslavement and continued colonial rule. When the Jamaican population had opportunities to participate in representative government, and the white property owners were exerting effort to maintain control over the colony and their status, Black and mixed race people were able to gain ground. But when the same Black and mixed race people who formed the island's overwhelming popular majority acted decisively to exert their own political will against continued efforts by the minority to preserve repressive rule, the white minority, the colonial government, again, comprised almost entirely of whites, deemed the Jamaicans unfit to govern themselves. Incidentally, after the 1843 fire, a Black entrepreneur, Charles P. Lazarus, began a new iron foundry that proved quite successful. A surviving business card that you see here offers a range of services, including building, maintenance, contracting, architecture, and so on. Born during the apprenticeship period, Lazarus's rise to prominence as an architect, builder, and engineer, and later politician suggests some room for class mobility, despite lingering racial subjugation. And Lazarus built this mansion in Kingston for George Steeble, another Black entrepreneur who trained as a carpenter in the 19th century, but who later made a fortune in Venezuelan gold mining. As a coda, though, the Jamaican economy was gradually shunted into the status of a formerly productive colony, curious as an exotic destination and site for extracting raw materials, as advertised in an 1891 international exhibition, replete with, as you see on the left, a Jamaican version of the Crystal Palace. And on the right is one of the exhibitions, a kind of catalog in the form of a bookshelf of exotic woods, raw materials to be extracted from Jamaica. But after slavery, the Jamaican public had little room for self-definition, perpetually impeded by its history of enslavement. And so by tracing the formation of Kingston through its infrastructural histories of material procurement or water supply to the enslavement plantation economy, my research here reveals these factors as indices of who counted and who continues to count among the urban public. And so what I'm proposing here in conclusion to my portion of this talk is that through historical studies like this, we can discern ways in which sites like Kingston continue to register the inequalities imposed on their inhabitants, nearly 2 centuries removed from the putative end of the era of enslavement across the British Atlantic world. And so I propose using research like this to investigate the ways in which our cities continue to palpably manifest such historical injustices in their built tangible forms in the infrastructure we have. And as we continue to discuss what counts as infrastructure in our world today, and how we might approach reconfiguring our cities toward the goals of greater equity combined with more conscious historical memory. And so thanks for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to Craig's talk as well and to addressing any questions or responses. But for now, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of overlap. So Craig, I'll hand it off. Well, I don't know whether I'm handing it off to Boyega or Craig, but thanks again, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Okay.
Thanks, Jonah. Yeah, Craig, please take over.
Okay. Just a second here. All right. I think we should be good. Okay. I don't think anybody needs to see me read, so I'm gonna do that and begin. Okay, so first, I'd like to thank the Dean, Chair, and Boyega for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I would also like to thank my panel colleague, Jonah, as well as the faculty, students, and erstwhile additional visitors for taking time to attend. I'm looking forward to this conversation that follows our brief remarks and hope that all will participate freely and with vigor. So, of course, now it's not working. Oh, it probably doesn't work on. There we go. Okay. So I'm an architect. And as such, I'd like to begin tonight by disclosing the principal medium of our work is not so much the visual object, the museum, the library, or a home, as beautiful as each may be, but the not so visual, the space within. Space is the essential material of my profession. Sculpting it is what we do. So it stands to reason that we might know a thing or two about it. Therefore, I'd like to be clear about this thing called space. It seems like such an innocuous thing, but in all my years of studying, shaping, and bringing it into focus, one thing I know for certain is that space is anything but. So let's start with the basics. By definition, the emptiness we perceive between two or more objects, the void between the solids, is what's almost universally considered as space. Space, as we typically understand it, is both neutral and ubiquitous. It's all around us, it's infinite, it is nowhere and everywhere. This spatial awareness is considered normal and universal. We understand space as an organized, well-defined, legible system of communication that constructs for us a common order, an order that is constantly reinforced in every aspect of our lives, every moment of every day. Through all manners of instruments like grids, buildings, codes, permits, laws, regulations, aesthetics, and the like, we've divided, labeled, organized, cataloged, prioritized, and commodified our shared space, at all times seeking uniformity of uses, expectations, and behaviors. It shapes us, molds us, our beliefs, our actions, and our entire beings, this space. Our concept of it as a singular shared impression of what's correct and proper about the void, the nothing. That's why permission must be given to use space unconventionally. For example, to live in a garage or a mobile home, grow fruits or vegetables in your front yard, hold a block party. All this and more require special dispensation. Conformity is the rule because hegemony is the goal. We are born into a pre-existing spatially organized world awash with the benefits such access to it brings. Yet, normative space demands submission for this access, for acceptance. So space, our ability to perceive it, to access it, becomes an essential element in our ability to become, know, name, and be who we are. I'm an American, a German, a Canadian, a New Yorker, a Chicago, a Bostonian. On scales large, small, and intimate, the primary function of space is to prioritize, define, mark, and order, instilling a particular kind of worldview, a particular kind of social order, creating a particular kind of identity to incorporate a particular kind of person. In short, space is existence. It is life. Access to its benefits is the wellspring from which all else flows. Now, because it's so important, it's simply taken for granted that everyone enjoys the equal access, the right and access to it, particularly in what we believe to be just and equitable societies. Yet, to paraphrase Baudelaire, the loveliest trick democracy ever pulled is the belief in the equal access to space. Because in truth, space is anything but equal. In truth, space is power. And there's never been anything egalitarian about that. Bullshit, you say. Fine, believe me, I understand the reaction. Without some egregious act against the common that necessitates the revocation of rights, we generally believe that in a free society, everyone has equal access to space. How could one not? It's all around us. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere for everybody. The doubters say, how can nothing be power? It can't. That's how. Perhaps, but indulge me. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's possible that space can be organized to be hostile, that shaping an ideal spatial aesthetic is done in ways that place some at a disadvantage. So much so that through no fault of their own, their basic access to space, to life, is heavily curtailed, always and in all ways. Let's say that's possible. What then? So perhaps for some whom space has turned hostile might want to know why, so they can address the cause of that hostility, to rectify what denies them full and unfettered access. Am I not American enough? Not articulate enough? What am I missing, and how do I get it? In search of an answer, they might study the spatially privileged in order to emulate them, to mimic and slip through unnoticed, to adopt their behaviors and mannerisms to gain acceptance, hoping that in time, space might grant them full access. However, they've already been marked as less than ideal, less than worthy. And that mark can't be wished away or mimicked into irrelevance. Something substantive must change for them or in them. Waiting on the benevolence of power will always leave one waiting. Power is never given, it is taken, and yet take they do not. Instead, they wait, they emulate, believing in their eventual admittance into normative space, where they'll be free to become who and what they wish. Never mind those demands may not be in their best interest. Never mind the process of emulation may leave them hollow, having given up so much for the privilege, they've nothing left of themselves they recognize. Never mind, they can do all that is demanded and more and still remain unacknowledged. Yet, comforted by the prospect of belonging, they ignore these concerns. They stand at the edges of normative space, waiting, wanting, practicing for that day, pretending to be something they're not, and probably never will be. Another response might be to make peace with the hostility, the partial, not quite full membership. It's a difficult truth with which to come to grips, though. Everybody wants to belong. Everybody wants to be accepted, no more than those for whom acceptance is believed to be damn near impossible. However, working within and around the hostilities of normative space requires the creation of a dual, symbiotic worldview to navigate its fickle nature. In essence, they become not bilingual, but bispatial. They know acceptance may be possible eventually, yet they also know that it is in no way guaranteed. So ignoring the reality of the present for the promise of the future is not really a viable option. Aspirations are fine as far as they go, but their everyday spatial condition remains temporary, fragile. They want to be accepted, but they don't wait for it. They know life happens when you're making plans. Another reaction might be to challenge the exclusion, to speak truth to power, so to speak. Those choosing this path confront the merits of each prohibition, confident that the hostility of the normative can't stand the scrutiny. That once revealed, the viability, if not the legitimacy, of each criterion will crumble. This is the space of protesters, the freedom riders, the marchers, the critical race theorists, the unintended martyrs who move through normative like Hamlet, taking up arms against the sea of troubles, past laws, sundown towns, First Nation reservations, restrictive covenants, redlining, and of course, lynching, to name only a few, and by opposing in them. It is a bold choice and a strangely hopeful one given the circumstances. Demonstrating a belief in the open egalitarian principles on which normative space is supposedly built, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But even here, they come as petitioners. In essence, they're supplicants. And until such time as their petitions are successful, supplicants they remain. Although its efficacy is often debated, there is yet a fourth response to the hostilities of normal space, and that is to simply reject them. Deprived of normative space, this cadre won't mimic because assimilation is of no interest. They don't care to be bispatial because duality is not their goal. They don't demand acceptance because they don't acknowledge authority. They don't care to integrate, don't care to commiserate, don't care to fit in, follow, acquiesce, or concede. They simply don't care. These denizens take extremely broad liberties with the common spatial narrative. They understand intimately that the price of normative space is, for them, too high, that they must give up too much to be a part of it. Rather than comply, they take space whenever and wherever they damn well please. If indeed space is life, then they outright reject any authority that deprives them of it or limits the terms of its use. They steal space on the edge, the center, wherever they can find it, wherever it's needed. Their spaces are rarely fixed, always moving, changing. They're taken spaces, hacked, mashed, mobile. If the normative space is hostile to their presence, then that's normative's problem. Yet, such brashness comes with consequences. In this case, rejecting the norm is to not only reject an agreed upon social order, but also one standing in that order as well. But then that's the point. They understand the frameworks that support normative space are not neutral. They only pretend to be. Where normative space is always already pre-existing and demands conformity from all, these spaces are intentionally iterative, conforming to the various creators, regardless of identities, bodies, or locations. These spaces are less definitive conditions, more suggested applications. Those choosing these spaces are comfortable navigating spaces that are always in transition. They rarely adhere to the kind of well-known rules of behavior, aesthetics, ownership, and economies that allow them to operate in a manner expected. These spaces rewrite the very DNA of normative space and alters it for as long as it's needed. When it's done, it moves on. Yet traces of its passing will always remain. These spaces travel, they permeate, and they disseminate. These spaces move when the inhabitants move, breathes when they breathe, and expands and contracts as needed. If space is power, the worst case scenario for those who benefit from the normative space is to encounter those who reject it. To believe that they have as much right to space as anyone else and act accordingly. Like Omar, they neither ask nor give spatial quarter. This is the stuff of nightmares for them, to be forced into a competition for the spoils of space. And at its core lies the fear of a perversion of the norm, but also of de-space expansion. Unable to do away with the variance that can neither be solved nor eliminated, think the matrix. The best they can do is minimize its destructive potential. In their eyes, these spaces are to be avoided at all costs, ameliorated if possible, policed if not. This is the reason normative reactions to de-space are so routinely, extremely visceral, so over the top. Why the normative narrative works so hard to crush these spaces, their uprisings in whatever location and manifestation they are found. It is against this backdrop, these spaces manifest, allowing the most daring to be in the world, to make meaning in the world. These spaces rework the normative, breaking bindings, dissolving boundaries, while making new places for the production of everyday life and helping to construct new ways of being. In opposition to spaces that flex the power to exclude, these spaces, in D-space, is in service to a project of identity and agency unavailable anywhere else. And while a cogent argument can be made that a rejection of something is still a reaction to it, that ignoring dominant foundational structures does little to dislodge their dominance, to those who posit such propositions, they say, you missed the point. D-space is not about denying something, it's about celebrating something. It's not about undermining something, it's about building something and someone and someone's. D-space is representation, it's validation. It takes the normative's benefits and democratizes them. If D-space teaches us anything, it is this. The hostilities of space cannot be countered by imitation, acquiescence, or intimidation, but by the production of one's own spaces for life. And make no mistake about it, the practice of everyday life is a spatial practice. And once learned and understood, who among us would willingly set aside such knowledge?
A lot of people view vacant lots in neighborhoods as a problem.
But one local couple looked at those empty spaces as opportunity, especially when a bunch of them opened up right next to each other in Northwest Detroit. Now, after a lot of work, it's become a park.
Located in the back of a home on Lenore Avenue, Willie and Jacqueline Moore started the nonprofit organization SDM2 Project Education in 2011, naming it after their daughters. Ironically, prior to this transformation, the place was just a combination of vacant lots. After more time passed, the two decided to expand further on their aspirations, totaling in one big backyard with more than enough activities for the youth, including archery, volleyball, and even more.
Whether it's reading, whether it's poetry, whether it's taking a walk, whatever it is, you have to let people know that they are valued.
D-space is a gift, but it is also a right. Seen through these twin lenses, it leads us to question ourselves and others. How does your spatial practice, your work, your production, your life flow from a position of self-sufficiency? How does it open up spaces in the public sphere, in the national dialogue for those who typically have none? How does it allow people to name themselves for themselves and have such naming acknowledged? How does it promote a more just and equitable society? Such questions are best served by long residence in D-space, for the multitude of responses are the foundation from which it is built.
Whenever I hear about Detroit, I almost always hear about how terrible it is. The collapse of the car industry, the violence, the drugs, the murder. But what I never hear about is the people doing extraordinary things. Sue Harris is a doer. She chose to move to one of the most dangerous streets in the city and build a village.
My name is Mama Shu. I currently live in Highland Park, Michigan. I am building a village. I am building Avalon Village. When I first moved over, I wanted to fix up the block because it was blighted. There was abandoned houses. We had mattresses. It was kind of bold looking over here, actually. So I'm like, we're gonna get over there, clean up and build a village. The idea is to create an eco-village, a self-sustaining place. When we take a walk, James, down there, you're going to see the Blue Moon Cafe.
Okay.
It's an abandoned gas station.
Okay.
You'll see that there's a house that's right next to it. We're going to tear it down and we're going to build a greenhouse. Then right next to that is going to be the Avalon Village Healing House.
Well, you literally have a plan for the whole street.
I know. And it's happening too.
It is happening. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
Yeah. You could have what the other neighborhoods have. You know, a lot of times the neighborhoods are ignored. But if we band together and we put the power back in the people, and the people decide that they don't want to live in certain conditions, then the people can do it. And I know that because our people, we're doing it.
Denizens of D-space understand such residence is an act of defiance, yes, but also of definition as well. It is a determined D, a dedicated D. D-space is as much about the work as it is the product. This is the D of the collaborative. For residents of this D, self-determination is a key.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was fantastic. Thank you both for your very insightful and provocative lecture discussions. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put in the chat. We will also take impromptu questions. Oh, Jonathan Jimenez has a question.
Ooh, buddy. So I saw from you examples of architecture being able to get people together or invite people from different backgrounds, right? What is an example of architecture that takes away people, like something that feels oppressive, you know?
To whom are you addressing that question? Or does it matter?
I just want to ask you this question because I thought that there would be like I thought that there'd be at least some sort of architecture that takes away, you know?
I'm not clear. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a pretty, well, I'll answer it this way. So I grew up in Chicago, and and so did my parents. And at the time, they went to the school, it was called Inglewood High School. It was a great high school. It was one of the, produced a lot of, well, my mom went to Inglewood, my dad went to Dunbar. But it was a great high school. Chicago is still one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. But architecturally, it was built, I don't know, maybe in the 20s or something or other. But it was one of those sort of classic architectural buildings, right? Architectural school architecture. Big high windows, lots of light, sort of the very kind of neoclassical forms, very, very symmetrical, big hallways, small crossways. It was in a sense, a very nice building to be in. But, they didn't necessarily invest in it all as much as they should have. And this is just, the normal way of education funding in general. It got to the point where it was more cost effective to build a new school. They built a new school. This school had no windows. You can look it up. It has what do you call them? These sort of very high slits in the area to let light in, but you can't sit in the class and look out the window. It's an oppressive building. It feels oppressive when you're there. That's just one example. There are others.
I could imagine the pain. Jesus.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that subject?
I didn't think that it would actually be possible for architecture to be oppressive in a way. It's honestly an eye-opener that there actually can be something like that. It goes to show how important building a building is.
And to just lay the icing on the cake here, both of those schools were in Black neighborhoods. I doubt very seriously you get away with building a high school without windows in a non-Black neighborhood.
So I was asking Jonah if he had some response to that.
I wanted to add a few things. To me, it's so interesting that the question here is where are the sort of examples of oppression? Because it seems to me so much more prevalent. Yes. That's what we see in the world, right? And especially, given Craig, your last, great example, especially in Black neighborhoods, the norm, I would think, is to build at, toward the bottom line. In other words, to eliminate anything but the, I was going to say, but the essentials. Windows are essential. That, mind blowing. That the only, that a building could be built without, eye level light coming in. But I would say, as an architectural historian, all of the examples that I showed are examples. The city of Kingston, the layout is precisely built for disciplinary control, which is exactly what I think, Jonathan, you're asking about, right? The kind of deprivation of self-determination. So Craig, all of what you showed were wonderful examples of, the kind of potentials of emancipatory, architectural sort of approaches to architecture that are so much more rare than I think the sort of the examples of disciplinary sort of deprivation of self-determination and liberatory kind of practices.
Well,
yeah. Go ahead, Pablo.
No. You were.
I had a question to either of you. You talk about how the examples you give are somewhat specific, but I ask in something like our typical urban environments where we're now having these pencil towers, and not only the pencil towers, the kind of publicization of the economics involved in that, and how the role of architect in all of that. Because I wonder, how would you respond on this subject, looking at some of these pencil towers, not just in New York City, but around the world? There's this competition that's ongoing now about these, we're talking about objects, but what would you say in relation to what they mean about space? Whether it's the space within them or the space they occupy, or even their kind of their view on the city line, the skyline, the space of the skyline.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I'm asking, do you think that those buildings or that movement is a kind of manifestation of this notion of, for want of a better word, de-space or destructive space? Whether is it positive? Is it a negative response? Because if you look at the skyline of any major city now, you have these mega towers. And if you talk about accessibility and the response to those buildings, if you're looking at it from one side of the city, one of affluence, your response to that view is one thing. If you're looking for those buildings from what I'd just say a more restricted environment, your attitude or your response to the spatial implications might be different. So I'm asking, without kind of imposing my prejudices, what your thoughts are about the impact of just pencil towers.
I don't know how, honestly, I'm not quite sure how to answer that, because I'm assuming what you mean by pencil towers are these, the very tall, thin stuff. Is that okay? I don't know that that's any different than what already exists in, certainly in space that people tend to engage, like on the ground. I do think, though, it's very symbolic, and it's a sign, and it's a sign that we tend to look at whether you want to or not. And that sign is, we can't get away from you fast enough. We can't find a place high enough to get away from you. And we will keep building and building and building until we don't even have to see you. That would be my response. I don't think it's so much spatial as it is symbolic.
So I might offer a kind of another interpretation here, and I'm not sure, Boya, if this is what you were sort of going for when you described these in terms of the kind of public aspect of how they fit within our urban structures. It seems to me I sort of can't look at, here in New York, 432 Park Avenue, right, as the sort of standard bearer, any number of these, though, that we might, these super tall buildings are speculative real estate sort of, materializations of private wealth, with the sort of added dimension that the kind of collateral for them is in the public realm, in the sense that the people who buy these apartments in them, to corroborate, I think, Craig, what you were just saying, the people who buy their apartments in them don't actually live in those apartments, right? So it's not even that these people are going so infinitely high that they will never even see the ground. They'll never even see New York, like that's not, they're never going to spend any time in these places. And so, and they're buying them basically as sort of shell corporations. So where I would maybe draw into some of the discussion that we've been having so far is to try to think through the question of where private capital goes, and maybe the counterpoint to this would be again, because we're in New York, a recently built project in the city, the Barry Dillers Little Island over on 14th Street, which is I loved, Craig, when you talked about space as both a gift and a right. Barry Diller's folly over there is exactly the opposite, which is to say it's presumably it's putatively a gift to the city, but a gift that no one asked for and no one needed. And maybe that's a good kind of gift, but it's one that it's basically, very literally building his own private land that is placed under, the sort of delusion of public space, but public space, in fact, where, like, if you want to go buy a drink there, you have to pay in to those particular places, right? You can't bring your own whatever. It's completely absurd, but we, as citizens of these places, give over our rights to the city, right? And so this issue, where I think I would like to sort of steer the conversation is, who has the right to the city?
Yeah, I've had this conversation for the longest, and not about that particular project, but just in general, and it's been heightened by the pandemic, and so years ago, maybe almost 2 decades ago, I sat on a panel that talked about the Mall of America. And for those who don't know much about the Mall of America, it is the largest mall in the United States, the second largest in our hemisphere. The largest is, I think, is in Edmonton, but they're both by the same developing company. Anyway, so prior to the Mall of America, it was built in Bloomington, Minnesota. Very, decent, nothing super great or bad about it, but, it did have, a very public persona, right? There were businesses on the street, all this other sort of, so people walked, and there was a kind of an understanding, even though it was in Minnesota, there's still kind of an understanding of how you're supposed to inhabit space. It was clear what was public and what was private. Streets, sidewalks, that's public. Buildings, and once you go and past someone's threshold, that's private. So Mall of America comes, puts all these businesses out of business, put all these companies, all these folks out of business. Those who weren't able to get a spot inside the mall were just done. So there's no communal space in Bloomington anymore. So it's in the mall, but the mall is designed to look exactly like, or to mimic the street to mimic the street that it just, destroyed. So it's a way to get you as an individual, a person, to come and feel like this is still, you still know what's going on. You still know that this is public, this is private. It's a simulacrum, right? And they put on performances there. They've got gazebos there. We've got an amusement park there. I mean, it has really done all it could do to manufacture and touch on our memories of what a city was like. But it's not a city. It is an entirely private enterprise. And you don't know that until you try to do something that they don't want you to do. You can't go in and you can't protest because it's private. So there was at the time there was I think it was PETA and some other folks were protesting one of the fur stores. Couldn't do it. They got put out. If this was in a public realm, they could do it. But nobody considers this not public until you try to do something. So it's really the privatization of public space. Where do we go? Where is the commons for us now? Where do we go where you don't have to spend money to access space? And here's why it is not a moot point. But because of the COVID, businesses have gotten all municipalities to give them our public space for their business. Like you can't, it's nice to sit outside, it's nice to be outside. Yeah, but you can't sit there unless you buy something. If you don't buy it, get out. Go sit in the middle of the street. You can't sit on the sidewalk because we now own it. The city gave it to us. But they didn't ask me. I pay for the street too. No, well, too bad. We are constantly giving away public space for private industry, always. And now we see that public space is incredibly important. It's incredibly important, absolutely important. Where do we go? When you're locked up for 18 months, right? The first thing you want to do is go to a store. Why don't you want to go to a public space? Because they don't have any. You can't take a lawn chair and sit right next to that business that has its own little tables outside. You can't take a lawn chair and sit right there and say, well, if this is public, I can sit here. No, they'll make you move. Why do you get that space and not me and not somebody else? We're just giving it up.
Something that I just want to add to that is it strikes me that in New York, we've seen exactly this this dynamic, right, of giving over our private, our public space to private businesses in the form of these sheds that are built out on the street. But I think what it's made me realize is that we had already been doing this with the amount of street space that we've given over to private cars, right? We've already devoted so much of our urban territory to, something that we haven't questioned before. The private car owners get to park wherever they want. Here now it's being formalized and the car owners are speaking up and saying, hey, I used to park there, you're giving away my parking space. But we ought to be questioning those assumptions that we had made even before this, giving over these kinds of spaces. One thing, Craig, that I wanted to ask, and I see we've got some great questions in the chat, so I'll just ask this very briefly, but it seemed to me that in some of what you were talking about in terms of sort of seizing space, stealing space, there potentially in that is an assumption that space is finite. In other words, that we're sort of led through this ideology, almost a delusion that the space that we inhabit is scarce and therefore falls within the kind of logic of commodification and the market logic of valuation, which again seems to me already an ideological assumption that we would want to push back against, right? That space is something that we can buy and sell. And so when you talk about the commons, I think it's important to maybe drive home that we're not necessarily talking about territory, right?
Yes and no. I think you're, yeah. I mean, well, that those are the mechanisms of capitalism in itself. It's gotta, there's you have to. It's not worth anything if it's not unique. So, you've got to, in a sense, we don't have time for me to go into my whole spiel about John Locke and, space and how that turns into property and how property is really, it's just a long thing. But the idea that space is infinite, is finite, I think is a fallacy. I think what happens is that the use of space becomes fixed. It's not space itself, but the definition of how a space can be used becomes fixed. And the idea of multiple uses and maybe even multiple owners is anathema. It's an anathema because it is, how do you legally make that happen? How do you write the code for that? How do you commodify this and categorize this in a way that you can make money off of that? How does that happen? Right? I mean, it's not it's not our legal system isn't set up for that. It's not set up for that. Our real estate system is not set up for that. Multiple owners of public space. Who's going to have the liability? Who's going to have this? Who's going to have too many questions? So, we have to fix it. It has to be fixed. So we know where it is, we know what it is, we know how to categorize it, we know how to sell it, and we know how to defend it, legally and otherwise.
Thank you both. Let's get to some of these questions. Pablo, I'll hold your question a little bit. I think you had a question. Do you mind if I hold it a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, so Diane, the excellent examples that Craig showed were begun as individual efforts. Could he give an example of a governmental, institutional, or cultural example of equitable space?
Yeah, I think those are, yes, I do believe that they were individual efforts, but I also think they were cultural efforts as well. I mean, you didn't see these folks here building, townhomes or apartment buildings or whatever. They were building spaces for people. And that was primarily, I would argue, driven by a cultural desire to enhance the lives of their community. So I just wanted to just sort of clarify that it wasn't an individual. And I don't even want to say it's an individual one. We saw this woman or these people on screen, and I know at least one of them, Mama Shu. But that's an idea that they have. That working on both the backyard and this other project, that's a community effort. They're not doing that by themselves. They may have had the idea, but they're bringing along all sorts of people to help them figure out how to do what they need to do. So I don't even want to say it's an individual effort, but I understand what you're saying. It's not an institutional effort. It's not an agency effort. It's being driven by other entities. So I don't know that I could point to, not at least not off the top of my head, of an institutional effort or a agency effort or even a municipal effort, simply because they are not situated in those D spaces. That's not what they do. It's not, they're not comfortable in those places. I would argue I've seen some things that kind of mimic though that idea, but not in, let's say, not in the neighborhoods that could probably use it most. Like, for example, here in Detroit, so we had a director of planning, Maurice Cox, and he's a colleague of mine. I like him very much. I think he did a lot of great stuff here, and he moved on to Chicago. But when he first got here, he got in trouble, and here's why. He's an architect and an urban planner, and he was in practice for a while, and he's also been in academia too. So he's done all those things, and also in the public sector. He was the director for the NEA for National Endowment for the Arts. So he's got a number of different perspectives in his head that he operates with. So there's this downtown Detroit, there's right a place where one major street, Woodward Avenue, runs into another major street, which is East Jefferson. And it's like, it's a T connection. You can only really go in one direction. It's both of them end up being a one-way when they come together. It's kind of awkward. There's nothing that you can really do in that area at all. And there are a number of streets that happen before that connection comes. And East Jefferson is right at the entry into a highway. So people are speeding up. It's just really a really bad place to have an intersection. So the planning department decided that, you know what, we're going to do this experiment. And we are going to, in the summer, we're going to close Woodward off a block early. And we're going to use that really bad intersection. We're going to turn that into a public space. We're just going to, we're going to paint it. We're going to put tables out. We're going to have performances. We're just going to turn that into a public space. People loved it. They thought it was great. So much so when it was a temporary thing. So when it was about to maybe not be so temporary anymore, people were like, no, let's leave it here. He got in trouble because he didn't ask the city council whether he could do it. He didn't really have to. He was the director of planning. And I'm sure he talked to the transportation department to find out, car counts and all that sort of stuff. But he didn't go through the quote unquote proper municipal channels that people would think you would have to go through. Because this is a temporary thing, but let's just see if it's going to work. That's why you hired me, right? And now it's pretty much permanent. I don't know if they voted on it to be permanent, but here's somebody who's thinking, not about cars, thinking about public space, thinking about people, who's getting in trouble for doing that. But it makes no sense to me. And while I use this example because right now there's a big roller skating rink out there. They put a big roller skating rink this summer for folks, and people are skating like crazy. Older folks who have never been have stopped skating for 50 years, pulling out their skates and going out there and having fun with their grandkids. It's just a great space. And people are just mad because you didn't ask me to do that. So people in municipalities, like I mentioned, in agencies and institutions, aren't supposed to act that way. They're not supposed to do that. They're not comfortable, but he's an architect and an urban designer and all this stuff. He knows how to make space. Most people in those positions don't. And most people who actually have the authority to do that don't. And the last reason I'm bringing this up is because I would argue this is also, in a sense, mimicking, or at least, let's say, multiplying. I won't say mimicking, but it's multiplying these efforts on both sides of the city of Detroit and in other locations as well. Chicago and the Biennale is happening in Chicago starting Friday, and there are a bunch of different similar kinds of projects going on there, where people, I'm sure you know about Theaster Gates and all of his work. It is, it almost has to start there, because those are the folks who see the problem in the way in which agencies and institutions and municipalities work. It almost has to start there. So I don't really see any institution doing any of this at all. And as a matter of fact, I would be suspicious if that was the case. Like, why are you doing this?
Thanks, Craig. Jonah, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I know it's a question to Craig, but any thoughts?
Craig, as you were talking about this, I was thinking there was a Times article the other day about Rochester and the sort of notion of Black capitalism that that Craig, your response, especially that last part, thinking through Theaster Gates. I just finished reading DeVarian Baldwin's book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, which again touches on some of these subjects. The idea of sort of working within the system, as it were, as opposed to trying to reformulate what that system might be, seems to me one of the urgent questions that, Craig, potentially you're sort of touching upon here. And another sort of reference point that I teach when I teach urbanism is sort of, I don't know how well known this example is, Floyd B. McKissick's project for Soul City in North Carolina. Yep. Again, very much in the spirit of Black capitalism, through a kind of collaborative engagement with rather than private ownership, the kind of distribution of profits with very sort of idealistic mode of what urbanism could be, that was undercut, unfortunately, by its private investors. But I guess what I'm trying to set up here is, and I love that you ended on you concluded your last response talking about institutions. I wonder if we can start to ask, at what level can we conceive of, for instance, Mama Shu as an institution, right? And when we start to think about it that way, can we start to take ownership over the city in a different way?
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right, and I should have started there before, is by asking, like, what do you consider an institution? Because you're right, you could call Mama Shu, she's certainly a force of nature, so she certainly could be an institution. But I interpreted the question, I could have been wrong, that it was really about sort of maybe formal structures of both political and economic power, but I could have been wrong. But I think you're right. Honestly, I don't know if the term matters. I think what matters are the structures that people, or whomever, whether it's an institution or whether it's an individual, the kinds of structures by which you address the in this case the spatial problem, the urban environment, and some of them are very bureaucratic and they take a very long time, and some people are tired of waiting. They're tired. As I said before, waiting on the benevolence of power, you will wait forever.
So thank you both. There are two last questions. There's a time limit here, so I just want to get those in. There's one from Ruth Dressner, and then Pablo, I believe, has a question. I'd like to end on Pablo's question, but the question from Ruth is,
How is there a time limit, man? This is a virtual world. We can say however we want. What do you mean a time limit? I don't understand that.
Space is limited, so is time.
NYIT needs to pay for the full Zoom license.
It's a money thing.
We're
Our
taking
time's running out.
We're taking contributions. The question, could you comment on occupying space by not just being in it, but by taking over its auditory landscape, horns, amplified music, passing cars, sidewalks, music, and I'd like to add bikes and scooters. Those bikes that terrorize our landscape right now.
Well, I can talk about this all day because it's part of my I don't know, 2-decade exploration in the hip hop architecture. But I would certainly cede the floor to, and I've been talking too much anyway, so I would certainly cede the floor to Jonah.
I'll say really briefly, and the question was directed towards Craig, so I'll just say what I think is interesting about this example is that when we talk about auditory landscape, I love that phrase. We're talking about the potential spatial transgression, right, or negotiation. That is, this is where I think the issues of infrastructure really come into play, and of public, right. The question of where one's sort of jurisdiction begins and ends. When we talk about noises, that necessarily problematizes those sort of strict spatial boundaries. So I think that's really fascinating. And then Boyega, when you bring up scooters and these sort of other elements of transportation infrastructure that force us again to ask what's private and what's public, these things that operate within those kind of blurred boundaries, those margins, I think are fascinating questions to ask.
So I'm not gonna get into the hip hop thing because we'll be here all night. But I am gonna give you another example, and this is an example in New York. I think this is in Washington Heights, or even maybe further up than that, where I read this article a few years ago. And it's absolutely spot on that, one of these areas that where there are a lot of people of color, a lot of African Americans, Dominicans, other nationalities, other parts of the diaspora who live quite differently than the folks who are now, in a sense, moving into the area. I don't like using the G word, so I won't say that, but you have new neighbors who are coming in. And so the article started off by talking about this sort of cultural habit of dominoes, and people playing dominoes on the street, setting up a table next to a building, and playing. And if you don't know how to play dominoes, or if you haven't played dominoes, think spades. If you haven't played spades, think bid whist. If you haven't played any of those things, you have led a horribly sheltered life. However, when you play these games, part of the fun is the intensity in which you play them. When you've got that last domino, or you've got that cut card, you're ready, and it's loud. And so you get these new neighbors who don't understand this culture. So they are layering their own expectations on space on top of this and telling people to be quiet and shut up. And if you can't be quiet, we'll have to call the police on you. You just moved here. You just moved here. What gives you the justification to tell us what we can't be doing that we've been doing for 20 years? Just because you got here, because it's too loud for you. Too bad. Too bad. So can you take over space? What was the term? Auditory landscapes? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely you can. You can make it to where people want to be there and where they don't want to be there. Of course you can.
Thank you. Pablo, I'm going to leave the last question to you. I mean, I have lots of questions personally, but I think I'll leave them to you. So Pablo, please go ahead.
I just wanted to thank Jonah and Craig. I thought that, Boyega, you did an excellent curatorial work in inviting Jonah and Craig, because I was very interested in the contrast in the presentations, because Jonah was referring more to the, if you want, to the means of production, perhaps, right? Like to, you know, in capitalist terms, you know, to the history of why we are where we are. And Craig was addressing, perhaps trying to address from a social point of view, what are the possibilities of action. And I was impressed by the clarity of Craig in addressing the conditions of space and the condition of power, and what are the possibilities of movement within that. And it makes me understand the city totally different. But to me, the real question here is the means of production, because the city, as Craig is identifying, right? The city became a private means of production, right? That's a neoliberal agenda, right? To profit from public space, and obviously gentrification, all the problems that we're seeing today. And by the way, they have been very clear with COVID, because if it wasn't for Central Park, which is not part of the neoliberal model, right? If it wasn't for Central Park, which also had other problems, right? Because it's also the place, space, where do we go, right? With the social distance, right? So the perimeter, the failure to me of the neoliberal model that we are seeing today, right? And in Craig's term is we cannot really wait. I mean, if you wait to act within the structure that has been projected to you, you fall into the game category, right? And you fall into just being allowed to do what you are supposed to be allowed. And then obviously the police is there to enforce that structure, right? The NYPD is actually a mega military force to enforce that nothing really changes in terms of occupying the public space and making sure that the public space becomes part of a profit for the 1%, right? And then the pencil towers are just a manifestation of that, right? In which obviously, as Jonah is saying, they don't even live there, right? So the city, and Bloomberg made that very clear, right? Bloomberg's agenda was to make the city a profitable center for the world, and we are living the consequences of that. So the question to me is, how do we, because also we see architects are less and less in the city, you know, in the city, in the township, right? In the city hall, right? In the, we have to actually log if we are actually trying to change the law, because that's seen as a competition, right? So everything is there, all the rules of the game and the rules of action and the structures are there to serve a very specific type of agenda. So how do we make sure that our actions don't fall into just playing a game that is already set up in terms of the move that we can do? What are the, if you want, the structural possibilities? I asked both Jonah and Craig to actually really move or change the world, even the fact that architects we are not any longer allowed to even be at the table, right? We have been displaced even from that. And I'm a little bit skeptical of, obviously there is a lot going on in terms of neighborhood participation and so on. But in Craig's term, I think, Craig, you're pointing to that. We are not going to make it if we start from the bottom, right? We need to address the structure of power. And how do we do that? I mean, is there any, other than deconstructing and having these interesting conversations, what are the possibilities of actions in structural terms?
I sort of agree and understand everything that you said right up until the end. I don't know I don't know where else you start except by those who are most affected. I don't know that I don't know that's the only group that's engaged, but I don't, if that group is passive, then there's no reason to change. So that is the catalyst. That if that doesn't happen, doesn't matter what I say, doesn't matter what the city says, because the city says won't say anything. It doesn't matter. It has to come from, those for whom change is, in a sense, life-changing. And I think, the architects have a huge role to play in that, in ways in which we can provide a number of things. One, we can provide the skills to sort of make this quote unquote change visible. We can provide the expertise to strategize with folks about how you do what it is that you're trying to do. I don't know that there isn't a single architect, at least someone who's running their own office, that doesn't have at least 1 or 2 point people within their city administration that they have their ear. I think that what I would agree if this is your where you're going, that the trajectory has to end with the people in power who have the authority to change something. But they're not going to do it unless they're pushed to do it. And I think, architects actually have a unique role because they can be on both sides of that. They can be on the side of sort of helping to organize thoughts, ideas, efforts, and energies, and also on the side of being in the room with folks who are actually making these decisions and making an argument to do this differently. I know I teach a course on public interest design, and we always every semester, get to a point where, like, oh man, I don't want to go off on my own. I don't really want to, but I really sort of think, how can I do this kind of advocacy work within an office? I sort of mentioned to them, I said, listen, there are things you can do where you are right now. So somebody comes to you and they say, oh, well, I want to do this new housing project over here. And yes, it may have, some people may have to move, but it's going to be okay. And we'd like for you to be in our project. And, you can very easily ask a couple of questions. One, who's funding your project? Where are you getting your money from? Oh, I'm getting it from Bank of America. Well, Bank of America is at the bottom of participating in their legally bound Community Reinvestment Act. They don't put money into this at all. And I can't work with you if you're going to work with a company that is just going to extract from this neighborhood and not give back like it's supposed to do. You can find another bank. Find another bank. I'll work with you. But I'm not going to be part of you extracting. I'm not going to be part of this extracting proposition. I'm not going to do it because I don't have to. And of course, they'll respond like, well, we don't have to hire you. We'll go over here. But but these are the things that we can do as architects. These are the things that we can do. We can make those kinds of decisions. We can encourage them to do something different.
Yeah, the one thing I'll just add to that, I agree completely with everything that Craig, you said. I thought it's really powerful to say that, architects have the capability to produce the kind of visible infrastructure. And the example of Kingston that I presented, and the reason that I find it to have some currency in the world that we live in is this idea of being able to define a public that I think is potentially an answer, Pablo, to your question, which is to say, when we can take something, a term like public that we assume to have a kind of meaning and reinvest it, in other words, expand who belongs to that category. And I think, we just saw a narrow margin of victory, if we can call it that, in California over the last day, where Latinx voters stepped up and saw themselves as part of a public that had something at stake. When that occurs, I think we are on solid ground. When people don't see them, when people see themselves alienated from that public, is when we're in dicier territory. And it seems to me that the forms of our cities, that the architects, that the urbanists, that the people who imbue, who give that form, when they can figure out ways of producing these, of involving more people into these definitions of public, that's when I would say we are, there's potential for a kind of hopeful reinvention of the systems that are otherwise potentially, frightening.
Yeah, I don't think it starts anywhere else but with those who are most affected. I really don't, because honestly, too many other entities don't care, and they will not do it unless they are pressed to do it.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a really powerful way to end this. Well, I don't really see it as an end because it's very eye-opening, and I hope we all take this and use it as a catalyst to, whether it's with our practices or just our thinking or our listening and understanding, because I think, Pablo, you're right, that this definitely makes me think very differently about how I appreciate the city. There are certain things that I think, as one of the reason I asked for this lecture, this particular subject, is there are certain things that I understand a certain way, but I'd like to hear people who know more and who really studied these ideas deeply and help me think of the city in different ways or have a different attitude as an architect and just as an occupant of the city. I think, Craig, what I was saying about the pencil towers is living in Harlem and looking downtown and seeing these monsters rise on the horizon creates a certain attitude to the city. I call them monsters, like the War of the Worlds, these things coming up. But what was also interesting about them is this very public presentation of how much wealth is involved in those as well. That seems to be part of the thing. The city didn't necessarily, I mean, there was always wealth of that type, but the city wasn't so public about it. And that's, that in a sense is another question about ownership and space. It ruins the space of the city. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Pablo, for your last question. Thank you both for the interesting discussions there. And I know, Craig, we could go on for another 2 hours, but
you said till 8, man. I have 15 minutes on my thing, but okay, that's fine. It said 8. I don't know, man. Your clock runs faster than mine, so.
No, my question is, do you just shut down at 8 though? We're trying to give you a cool off period.
No, I don't know.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you everybody for attending, and hopefully the next, I'm sorry, I can't remember the next lecture date.
The next lecture is on October 6th, and it's Female Voices in Architecture, and it's coordinated. It's an event organized by Trudy Brents, Farsana Gandhi, and our Dean Maria Parvellini, and we have Soki from Soki Studio in New York City, and Mariana Ibanez from UCLA. Yeah.
Thank you. So, go ahead. So that's another very interesting lecture, but thank you all very much. And I guess at this point, I will call it. And great thanks to you guys for your.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the invitation. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Jonah, for your presentation and for the conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Jonah. Thank you, Boyega. Great conversation. Great presentations.
Ciao.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.